Hello, I'm Mr. Johnston, and this is Biology. Welcome to the 1.9 podcast. We're going to talk about carbon today. In reality, we're going to kind of focus on organic chemistry, which will be the chemistry of life. But organic chemistry is going to revolve around one element the most, and that's going to be carbon. I'm sure you guys have heard carbon when people talk about carbon-based life, when people talk about that's kind of the basis for all life as we know it. And it is a big deal. So we'll discuss kind of why carbon is such a big deal as we get where over the next several sections we're going to talk a lot about the chemical aspect of life. Because as I've told you before, we're kind of a puddle of chemicals that happens to work in a specific way and do certain things that allow us to say we're alive. But as soon as we stop doing those specific things, you're back to being, well, dead or abiotic. So we're going to focus a lot on just what we're made up of. Because ultimately, when you look at a cell's made up of around probably 100 trillion different atoms, all working together, much like our bodies themselves are made up of about 100 trillion cells, all working together to make us into a fully functioning person. So, as we kind of describe some of our terms, so if you see me talk about organic chemistry, organic compounds, it's just going to be these compounds that contain carbon. That's the one thing they all have in common. There's typically going to be several other elements that are with it. So when you see them talk about organic chemicals, you oftentimes see what I call CHON, which will be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Those three are found in pretty much anything organic. And then the other most common guy that you see outside of those three is nitrogen. So I just kind of remembered as CHON, and that's the elements that we'll commonly see that make up the backbone, the molecular structure of pretty much everything that's in our cells, in our bodies. And the idea of organic compounds really just comes from this idea where organic compounds are ones that tend to be found primarily from life. And so these are compounds that we tend to see that are produced by living organisms, whereas inorganic compounds are oftentimes created through regular chemical processes that occur in nature without life being involved. You know, these are just regular degradation from being around acids, or they can get together with lightning or whatever else, but life isn't typically involved in them. Whereas with these organic compounds, it's really going to focus on life. Not all organic compounds only come from life, but like once again, we'll see that's mostly where they come from. So there's reasons that we look for certain things like gases like methane on other planets, because we're trying to see if we can find some of these things that are organic that, as far as we know, tend to come from living organisms. So if we can find some of those, it gives us evidence that perhaps there are some, I guess we could say, alien life forms, although once again I'm discussing probably like cells, not necessarily rectal probes. So we can see if there are these alien life forms that might be living that are somewhat similar to ours, because we're assuming that. We don't know what alien life would look like if it's not like ours, because we've never seen it then. But if it's something like ours, it could potentially be putting out these organic compounds that we can try to pick up on. Now these organic compounds are going to be held together by chemical bonds. So that's just going to be bonds that hold together separate atoms and allow them to kind of stick. And there's two strong bonds that you'll see in chemistry, but we're only going to really talk about one of them here in biology. And so that'll be a covalent bond. You might have learned, or you might hear people talk about, where it's kind of like you share electrons. For our purposes, I'm not going to get crazy with this, so that's fine. The idea here is it just allows two atoms to want to kind of coexist stably, closely tied to each other. You know, they don't want to get farther apart, they don't want to get closer together. They're in this stable arrangement where they're next to each other, kind of tied together in a fairly strong way. You know, they don't want to shift from their current situation. There'll also be some weaker things we'll talk about that have bonds in the name. These aren't typically as strong as actual bonds, but in case you ever see something like a hydrogen bond brought up, these will be much weaker than covalent. So I'll put weak here. They're much weaker than covalent bonds. But ultimately they will also help us hold either separate atoms together, or in many cases separate molecules. So like one water will want to stick to another molecule of water because of these hydrogen bonds, because of these attractions that are, I guess the easiest way to describe these would be like, think of a situation where it's more like a magnet, where they actually have a slight charge, and if you remember, opposites attract, so positives like negatives. You know, these are going to attract if you have either. And so things like hydrogen bonds come from where we've got like this slightly positive part of a molecule and a slightly negative, and so they want to attract. And so these will help hold the atoms and the molecules that are in our body together in the specific ways they need to function for us. And then when we want to change what we have, because you might have a compound like H2O, water, but you might want to have it be altered to be something else. Like for instance, in some cases we'll see we split this up into ions called H+. We'll pull off electrons, which I'll write as E negative off there, and we can actually make oxygen. And so I can balance this out here so we're doing okay. So when you go through and look at this, you can see that we can alter things sometimes where this covalently bonded water can actually be split apart. And so whenever something like that happens, we call that a chemical reaction. So our body has lots of chemical reactions where we take complex things like fats, the stuff that's in your food, and we can kind of tear that apart into pieces. We can rip apart these bonds. And then we can also reform them. So you can reform stuff like the muscle that's in your arms. You can store fat within your body as long-term energy reserves. So in our body, we're constantly kind of tearing things apart and building things up. And all of that's going to be part of organic chemistry. And ultimately, all of that's going to involve these chemical reactions. And so we'll talk more of those as we get to things like metabolism, which is really the study of all of our body's chemical reactions. So as we talk about these compounds, which remember just multiple different elements or atoms stuck together, we're going to be talking about organic stuff primarily when we're in biology. And so now we're going to discuss, well, what's so special about carbon? Because we've already said it's got some other guys, but this is still largely based upon carbon. That's still our poster child for organics, if you will. So carbon is a unique guy in where he wants to ultimately get with everybody. You could say that he's perhaps a little bit of a player, but it wants to bond with just about anybody who's around, because carbon likes to form 4 bonds, and that's about the max that you can get chemically, and carbon does this more stably than anybody else. You know, a lot of things that can form 4 bonds don't typically like to do so. Carbon does. So the number of bonds is a big deal as far as carbon goes because it can form so many. That gives a lot of possible molecules that can be made, because it's not like you're just going to get H2O and that's it. You know, you can have 2 other guys, so you can have carbon where you have, you know, CH4. And so CH4 is going to have 4 bonds, 1 to hydrogen. But then you also have things like CH3Cl, and you could change this to CH3Br and CH2Cl2. So you can see that we can start to get lots of different compounds. I mean, if you keep building them up bigger and bigger, you can get to pretty much an infinite amount of organic possible compounds because of just how fluid it is in terms of what it's willing to pair up with those 4 bonds. And beyond that, it does something that most things don't like to. It loves itself. And what I mean by that is carbon will bond, I'm just going to draw a line to represent a bond, to itself. And so we can get, in some cases, just thousands of these guys stuck together. We have some structures like diamond, graphite, where they are just a whole bunch of carbons that are bonded to each other. And depending on exactly how they bond to each other, they can do it in slightly different ways. You can get either graphite or diamond. There's different arrangements that give us different structures. And so it's pretty cool that you can get such a variety of things from carbon, even just using carbon, you know, without even throwing in the hydrogen and the oxygen and whoever else you want to, because it's willing to bind to itself. Whereas most things will never bind to anything more than perhaps one other guy. So you might see like O2 or H2. But beyond there, you typically don't see things continue to bind to themselves. So carbon's unique in that aspect. And then lastly, carbon's willing to not just single bond, you know, not just kind of share 1 electron with other guys. It's willing to share up to 3. And so what that means is I could share 3 electrons with 1 other atom who's also sharing those 3 with me. And so we call that, if you're sharing 3, you know, where each person, I guess, is donating 3 electrons to share, you're going to ultimately get this triple bond. If you have 2 of them that you're sharing together, 2 each that you're kind of putting in the pot, that's going to be a double bond. And so we draw those typically as multiple lines connecting them. So you can have double bonds. I'll just show it between a carbon and a carbon. And you can have triple bonds. And so we have kind of like the complete diversity of possible bonds here. There's many things that cannot form double bonds. There are many things that cannot form triple bonds. Carbon does all that. So it'll form 4 bonds happy. That's about as max we're going to get. It's willing to bind to itself, which is pretty odd, especially in large amounts. And it's willing to double and triple bonds with stuff. And if you throw in like this long chain of carbons, you could have thousands of them. If you throw in even one double or triple bond, that will ultimately somewhat change the characteristics of that molecule. So it gives us even more options in organic compounds, which can then give us a lot of options in terms of what we can do with it. It gives life a lot of ammunition, if you will. But I want to make sure you realize that they also have a tremendous capacity for energy storage. And so this is why you can go and eat a hamburger, you can go eat bread, any of these organic chemicals, and it helps power our bodies so that even relatively small amount when it comes down to it, amount of food can allow our brains to work properly, can allow us to do all the normal functions where our heart's constantly beating, we're breathing, as well as do tasks like running around and lifting weights and all kinds of stuff. If you also want to view it in the standpoint of you've got these organic compounds and things like gasoline, and you can think how like 1 gallon of gasoline is technically enough to put into a vehicle that might weigh 5,000, 6,000 pounds, and in many cases drive it for about 20 miles. This is a really long distance with a whole bunch of weight, and you're doing so with a pretty compact amount of fuel, in this case a gallon of gasoline. So when you talk about fossil fuels, they're organically derived from these substances from life millions of years ago, and you can see just how tightly packed they are with energy. Just like our bodies, we have quite a bit of energy that's packed in here, and that allows us to function and do all the things that we do, and in many cases take for granted, without having to constantly sit there and eat and eat and eat. Because of how much is packed in these, especially carbon and hydrogen bonds, these organic bonds. They're very energy dense. And then the last one's just going to be a kind of quick intro into what the next 4 sections are going to be. So the next 4 sections, we're going to go into the types of what we'll call macromolecules. But these are going to be the 4 groups of organic compounds that we typically find in our bodies that our cells are made up of. So we're going to focus, one each is going to have their own section. And so we'll have carbohydrates. So you guys will normally associate this, rightly so hopefully, in general with sugars. And this can be complicated ones that you'll call complex carbohydrates, or simple ones that are more like glucose or table sugar, sucrose. So that'll be carbohydrates, breads, things like that. We'll have lipids, which most people, when they think about lipids, think about fats or oils. There's other types, but ultimately this will be like fats, oils, steroids, waxes. There's a bunch of stuff that kind of falls under this category of lipids. But we normally know them as being very energy dense. That's why if you have a lot of fat, ultimately you end up with a lot of calories, a lot of energy, because this one ultimately has more energy than any of the other ones. And a lot of people vilify fats. They're probably not near as bad as what a lot of people say. But a lot of people like to look at the lipids, they look at the back of the food label, and they oftentimes kind of, single that one out as being the bad guy. But that would be lipids. That's what you guys would see on the back of a label. This is what your bodies are made up largely of, is going to be lipids, and specifically we have quite a few things that will be made up of fatty acids, so what we could think of in terms of a fat or an oil. Then we've got proteins. These guys will be, I would say, the most important in terms of things because they're very diverse. They're a huge part of our body. In some cases, up to 50% of our dry weight is proteins. And we've talked before that these guys are kind of linked to our genetics. So these are ultimately what's produced by a gene. So a gene kind of codes for a specific protein. And the protein is the thing that actually does most of the things in our body. And so most of our colors, the reactions we can do in our body, a lot of our structures, those things will all come down to proteins. So if you're ever in doubt, usually this is kind of the go-to, is to go to proteins as being our default important macromolecule. But you guys can obviously look in the back of food too, and you can see how much protein something has. Currently it's quite a big craze that people think if you have enough protein that you'll build muscle. That probably doesn't work that way, but ultimately it's still out there, and so I'm sure you're aware of it, and some people might even be counting how many grams of protein they get. And then nucleic acids, this is really just going to come down to molecules of DNA and RNA in our body, and so this is some of the stuff that's going to literally be what a gene is composed of. So DNA is essentially, a section of it is a gene, and then that gene codes for a protein. So nucleic acids are critical because they are going to be used, as we talked about before, as information storage. So these are the guys that kind of control what makes you you. And they're also the things that we can pass on. So you can pass on your specific version of things to your offspring, which we've already said is critical to the idea of evolution and natural selection. explains how you can take your advantageous traits and by having lots of children, pass them on to make them more common in the next generation. So that'll come back to nucleic acids. Those ones aren't normally nutritionally given such a big deal, that it's not what our bodies break down primarily for energy, but obviously we do need nucleic acids to break down to rebuild our own DNA as our cells divide, because whenever your cells divide, you have to make a copy of your nucleic acids, your DNA, so that each new cell, because you went from 1 to 2, has a full copy of all of your DNA, of all of your genes, so it is able to produce the right proteins and able to survive as a living organism. Beyond that, that's it for now. We're going to go through and pick up with carbohydrates shortly, and then, like I said, we'll go through the rest of these guys in turn. Hope you guys enjoyed yourself and had a good weekend. Take it easy.